Gentlemen, Judith, I need I'm calling everyone to attention. Great, I'm glad everybody's enjoying one another's company, and we want that to be the dynamic, but we have a lot of interesting components to the day ahead of us, and I'm thrilled with what is coming next. You all are obviously free to continue eating. Garry is fine with people getting dessert and doing what they need to do, but I know you all are going to be real fascinated by this opportunity to hear Garry speak. I'd like to introduce, for the introduction of Garry, a great friend of mine just in the last 6 months, really. Guy who I've gotten to know through our board member, Ron Slimp, who's sitting up here in the front. But Sandy Saunders is a new member of the Kemp Legacy Council. He may even not even know that's what it's called, but that's the group that he's joined, and we really appreciate his and his wife Beth's support. We had a great dinner with Beth and Sandy and some others last night. And Sandy is the co-managing shareholder of the D.C. office for Greenberg Traurig. He's a senior member of their white-collar defense and litigation team, and he was also a key member of Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Did I come close to saying it right? Khodorkovsky's international defense team. He's a fellow at George Mason's Center on Terrorism and Transnational Crime and Corruption. Ladies and gentlemen, Sandy Saunders. So talking to the mic.
Is it working now?
Well, the mic is working for the live streaming, but you've got a... Yeah, it's a fake mic.
Well, thank you, Jimmy. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Thank you to the Kemp family for allowing me and my wife to participate in the foundation. As Ron said, it's food for the brain, and it's a luxury to be able to take the time away from work and to be able to focus and think and what to look forward to for our country. And more, as the 2014 election come up and the 2016 election is in the nearing horizon, you hear more and more people talking and mentioning Jack Kemp's name. And the principles that he stood for are becoming just as relevant as the days he was active on Capitol Hill. It's my privilege today to introduce, and it's a little tough to introduce somebody who's already been introduced, so I won't spend a lot of time telling you that Garry Kasparov is a chess player of note. But what not everybody knows is that in addition to being a great chess player, he's also on a very short list for one of the braver people that I've ever met in the world. Because in America, we don't have a clue as to what he goes through on a day-to-day basis to speak his mind. And the luxury to have a meeting like this, as Jimmy mentioned, I've spent the last 12 years as being defense counsel to Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the Russian oil magnate who spent the last 11 and a half years in jail. I met with him 2 weeks before he was going to jail, and as an idealistic American lawyer, was very eager to think about what his defense was going to be and the nuts and bolts and who the witnesses were going to be. He knew he was going to jail, and he looked at me and he said, I know I'm going to jail, I just don't know for how long, but what's important to me is that I come out with my reputation intact. And you're now going to learn the differences between thinking like an American and thinking like a Russian. And I've spent a lot of time trying to hold on to that and trying to think about that. I don't have any answers, but what I've seen, and I sat next to Garry in the courtroom for Khodorkovsky's trial for several weeks, months. He wasn't there for months. I was there for months. But he was always there. He was with people speaking out in the street and paid a personal price. And when I talk about a personal price, there's a physical price to be paid for speaking your mind in Russia. Probably the greatest understatement I heard today may be that Putin is comparable to Stalin. We may be wrong on that because Putin's light years ahead in what he's thinking about for what he intends to do. His goals are broader. But Garry has stood up. He leads the political, or was one of the leaders of the political opposition in Moscow, it takes great personal strength and great fortitude to do that. And it means sometimes you can't go home. But sometimes to make your home better, you have to leave it and express the ideas that are necessary to make it a better place. So Russia's a fascinating place. It's a real challenge for the United States right now. Mitt Romney had it right. And administrations for years have been ignoring Russia, have been ignoring Putin, thinking that he was another Gorbachev and that he could be handled with personal relationships. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people in both administrations who told me I was crazy. But here we are today, and Ron's a board member. Sitting here, we have colleagues and friends in Ukraine, and they don't think Putin's crazy. They just know he's dangerous. I have colleagues in Warsaw, in Poland, who were talking about the last time they were invaded, and they're scared today. But now we have somebody who can tie it back to leadership and what the United States means, and it's very fitting that somebody who's standing out as a leader and speaking his mind is going to talk about the Kemp idea and the American idea here today. Garry Kasparov.
Thank you very much. Sandy, I'm always afraid to hear introductions because in the era of Wikipedia, I'm scared to learn something about myself I never heard of. Now, you saved me from this embarrassment. So, and thanks to the Kemp Foundation, to Marcy Robinson-Shore for reaching out to me about this remarkable event. So when I first heard the title, The Future of the American Idea, I could barely believe it because it was so perfect from my perspectives, and that's the theme that Jack Kemp held so dear. Like probably half of the people here in the room, for the last few years I've been working on a book project. I never had time to finish. Its central theme is the shift in American values over the past, say, 40 years. How Ronald Reagan's shining beacon on the hill of my Soviet youth has slowly moved away from the values of individual freedom, sacrifice, risk-taking, and faith, both domestically and in foreign policy. Those traditional American ideals have been gradually replaced with those of security over risk, of equivalence over excellence, of comfort over sacrifice, and hyper-partisanship over unity. So the working title of the manuscript is a little shocking to some, Un-American, but it's perfectly accurate. Of course, I'm myself un-American. Also, I like to say that I was born in the deep south right next to Georgia. No, it's a fact of my biography. I was born in the capital city of Azerbaijan, in Baku, in the deep south of the USSR, right next to the Republic of Georgia. And growing with some outspoken uncles and a die-hard communist grandfather, I was exposed to political theory at a tender age, almost as early as chess. But the title Un-American comes directly from the dictionary. Adjective, not characteristic of or consistent with American customs, principles, or traditions. And in my opinion, there is much about the America of 2014 that fits this description far too well. And this is tragedy, not only for Americans, but for the entire world that has depended on and learned from the United States in economy, in military, its military, in technology, its moral leadership for over a century. This also means that America's challenges are the world challenges. And for all the talk about multipolar world, the G20s or G0, the rise of China, a new Cold War with an oil-rich dictator in charge in Kremlin, America cannot be so easily replaced. As Jack Kemp said, there are certain fundamental concepts about human dignity and the rights of man which, if not defended by America, will not be successfully defended by anyone else. If there is any doubt on that, ask the people of Syria or people of Ukraine. These American values are based on believing that human freedom is of maximum value, both at home and around the world. It is not only the United States that is criticized, but the system that made America and the world so successful. And by system, I do not mean democracy, although the rise of China and the arrogance of dictators like Putin and Assad in the face of weak Western opposition has allowed the superiority of democracy to be questioned. An even more dangerous delusion is the increasing attack on the free market concept itself, attacks on the principles of capitalism that have created unprecedented standard of living. On one hand, the critics are correct. It's important to talk about the ills of the society. For example, poverty was Jack Kemp's signature issue, a free market approach instead of a welfare approach. He also understood that capitalism had to mean more than the acquisition of money. In another excellent phrase, he said, democratic capitalism is not just the hope of wealth, but the hope of justice. Justice. It's a very powerful word. The power of this phrase, it's economic justice to the poor, to the citizen of a communist country, to those living in totalitarian regimes. And many have forgotten that the American dream was not just to get rich. Immigrants did not come to the American shores because they thought the streets here were paved with gold. Maybe some did. But the American dream for many was for their children to have a better life. The immigrants came because in America they would be rewarded for their hard work. And if they got rich, okay, it's a side effect. No one objects to that. And in recent years, the attacks on capitalism have increased as inequality has increased. It's a logical correlation, but also a false one. Thomas Piketty's new book, Capital of the 21st Century, has become the rare economic bestseller, although I'm not sure how many people who bought the book are actually reading it. But I believe that it's not capitalism that has failed us. I believe it's us who failed capitalism. If we go back to this word justice, and if we look at the classics, Adam Smith, correct me if I'm wrong, but I never read in Adam Smith's works anything about the size of the corporation offering immunity against bankruptcy. And if small business in North Carolina is bankrupt, it goes belly up, so must Goldman Sachs. And when the state steps in, deciding which companies live or die, things have gone terribly wrong. I agree with the concept of a small government, but before we move into the size of the government, we have to agree that government should not intervene in the economy. And I think this element has been missing in the debate. And I think that GOP is yet to make its position clear in anticipating the role of the government before talking about the size. And making clear that everybody is equal before the law and everybody will be judged by the market without government officials, even with the best intention, deciding which company survives and which company goes under. So today we are more and more using the stock market as a substitute for everything else. But less and less does the market represent the health of the nation, let alone its values. And just when the market is about to do its real job of cutting the weak, the government steps in. When you base your policies on principles, there is no room for but. This is a very short but critical word. We believe in the free market, but trouble. We will defend democracy and freedom and human rights, but not in Ukraine. Trouble. Rising inequality is a defining problem, but it comes from decades of moving away from the principles of excellence that had created the richest society in history by the end of the 60s. It's obvious that after 2 long engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq, American people are now eager to hear about America's global responsibilities, about the importance of standing up for freedom around the world. Syria is far away, and there are very few good guys, and let bad guys kill each other. Ukraine is far away, and Putin is too strong. He's a tough guy with lots of oil. But when you betray the notion that freedom is worth defending everywhere, you begin a very dangerous path for America and the world. The US, Europe, and other democracies thrive with stability. Dictators like Putin, especially ones who depend on energy resources and high prices for oil and other energy resources, they thrive with instability. America generally wants, to resolve Middle Eastern crisis with Iran without major explosion. Putin is dreaming about any war in the Middle East that could help the oil prices to rise. So economic growth requires stability, and that cannot exist when Putin can annex a chunk of Ukrainian nation with impunity and launch a paramilitary invasion of eastern Ukraine while diplomats dither. And okay, we talked about Putin being too dangerous, this notion, and compared to Harry Truman. I mentioned that already at our panel. And it's time now just not to react on Putin's immediate actions, but as I mentioned, to start thinking about long-term strategy. Harry Truman, in my view, was a great president not because he saved West Berlin, not because he saved South Korea and Taiwan, not because he had an idea of Marshall Plan which saved Western Europe from communism, but because he laid down the foundation for the future victory on the Cold War. He came up with institutions like NATO, CIA, Voice of America, that eventually played a pivotal role in the victory 40 years later. It's time to start thinking long-term. And I still believe there are great, opportunities that could be offered by this country. And what we're lacking today is a leadership. Leaders willing to stand up to dictators who only respect strength. Ronald Reagan did not need Truman's track record to command the respect of the Soviet leaders. They knew he cared vitally about human rights in Russia, in the Soviet Union, and elsewhere, because he was never afraid to bring it up with them. And they knew Reagan was not afraid to act, which usually meant he did not have to. Reagan had 2 things recent free world leaders lack: principles and the credibility only principles can provide. Assad and Putin jumped over Obama's red line against chemical weapons in Syria, and Assad is still in power, still murdering people. And as I wrote at the time of this crisis, the brotherhood of dictators was watching Syria closely. And if Obama had acted there, I believe that we would not be hearing stories about Russian troops in Ukraine. Each time we show weakness, the next crisis will be worse, will be more costly. The price to resolve this crisis will go higher. The Cold War was not won just because of American technology or the disastrous communist economy. It was also values, what the whole world called, or used to call, and still some people call, American values. For those of us behind the Iron Curtain, we knew people outside genuinely cared, that we in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe, we were not alone, and that individual liberty was for all, not just for those lucky enough to be born into it. And just for a minute, I can slide into a more academic note. Think of three fundamental documents that establish in writing our definition of modern civil society. The English Bill of Rights, 1689. The American Declaration of Independence, 1776. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man, 1789. So, trivia question. How many times is the word democracy mentioned in these three documents? The answer is 0. Because the method by which leaders were chosen was not yet a relevant issue. The fundamental rights that define the relationship between the government and the people, that is what mattered. And that is still true today. Central among those rights is individual freedom, the unifying theme. Individual freedom is the basis for the free market system of all successful economies. It's the basis of a foreign policy that says freedom for others is as important as for one's self. Individual freedom is the core of the American rights and values that, in my opinion, have been under attack and in decline in the United States for over 30 years. Origins of these values shift, I think, from the 60s to today. Risk, excellence, sacrifice, faith, unity. American values that were good for the world and good for the American economy. Not coincidentally, these are also values of innovation and entrepreneurialism, of the new technology, new industries, and new jobs. Since roughly the 70s, there has been a shift away from those values and toward their opposites, as I mentioned at the start. A shift toward security, equivalence, comfort, cynicism, and hyper-partisanship. In the span of one generation, the world's greatest entrepreneurs and capitalists convinced themselves that they could be rewarded without risk. It's a time to wake up from this dangerous delusion built on a mountain of debt. It's time to dream again of exploration, excellence, and everything else that made and makes America great. I'll employ a familiar anecdote about a Democratic president, since Jack Kemp was proud to be a bipartisan politician. So risk means taking on big challenges, aiming high. So its physical expansion was always a very important part of American dream. So conquering the West, these vast territories, going up to the skies or just down into these deep oceans. And there is a reason people return again and again to the 1969 moon landing as a crowning achievement of American ambitions and ingenuity. This incredible feat also must be considered one of the least practical endeavors ever attempted. President John F. Kennedy admitted as much when exhorting the American people to support the cause during his famous "We choose to go to the moon" speech at Rice University in Houston on September 12, 1962. The speech's most famous line, in fact, is the plain statement that America chose to go to the moon because it was hard, not because it was easy. I think any other politician today will be impeached if he says that. And it would have been easy for Kennedy to play the Cold War card more heavily in his speech and to emphasize the strategic military importance of the space program. But instead, he relied on the grandeur and difficulty of the challenge itself to inspire the audience and the American nation. Kennedy believed in the power of a great dream to change the world, despite or because of its impracticality. He was also enough of a politician to mention the number of jobs that the manned space program would bring to Houston. And he also discussed the cost. I mean, something that was forgotten. And he mentioned that it would cost $5,400 million. Because at that time, Americans didn't understand the concept of a billion. And he mentioned that this amount, a huge amount by the standards of the early 60s, was less than Americans paid for cigarettes and cigars every year. So amazingly, it worked. People accepted the sacrifice, embraced the dream and the challenge. And it's also hard to imagine that in 1969, when Americans landed on the moon, and the 3,500 IBMers worked for this project, and we could see the pictures of these rooms, filled with massive computers. The entire computing power of NASA was size of one iPhone. It just imagine the power and the creativity of people who could come up with just not with the concept, but with the real implementation of something that nobody thought would be possible to achieve. Using 128 kilobytes to write a software that could bring man to the moon and back safely. And when I hear stories that today, we already did everything, so what else could be done? We just did not appreciate the fact that with this little device in the pocket, we have immense power. And it's up to us to restore the great dreams and to look up to the skies or down to the oceans and recognize that there's still the huge territories for us to conquer. And to finish, I'll come out of the stars, out of the clouds, dreams, and oceans, and talk about the reality of democracy, elections. Okay, I can mention that I'm also running now for the presidency of International Chess Federation, which is the fight against, guess, another Russian, who is there for 19 years, and who has effectively turned this organization into the massive KGB money laundering machine. So I have 176 votes, so from the United States to Palau, one country, one vote, and that's why I live in the plane, just traveling around, so hoping that eventually we can take it out of Putin's hands. But okay, you also have elections here in 2014. So, and of course, everybody is concerned about winning elections and about short-term perspectives, next polls, midterm, the presidential elections. But maybe again, since I'm un-American, I can afford to be more critical and to try to look at the big picture. Because sometimes it can work tactically, but eventually it will fail strategically. And I believe it's time for GOP to come up with the long-term vision. I do understand that, sometimes long-term vision may hurt short-term calculations, but eventually you win, and the country wins, and the world wins, because everybody will be better off. And there are two historic examples that are probably just, quite relevant. One of them is from from British Empire. Benjamin Disraeli, in 1867, due to the reshuffling of the party, has become prime minister. The title he has coveted for his entire life. He could play safe and stay prime minister, probably just, to survive elections. But he pushed for the reforms, adding new voters, the bill that was so important in his calculations to build a new Tory party, actually the Tory party. He pushed the bill, but because it went against the interest of many voters, he lost the last elections in 1868 to Gladstone. And he was in opposition for 6 more years. But in 1874, he came back triumphantly because the coalition that he created, the coalition of aristocracy and the working class, brought him into power. And when we look at the history of the Tory, of this party, of the 20th century, I could say it reflected Disraeli's grand vision. Two greatest leaders of Tory in the 20th century, Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher, had the heritage on one side of the Duke of Marlborough, and on the other hand, the heritage of a town grocer. So it worked out. And going back to the United States soil, some probably painful memories for many in this room, 1964 elections, the worst electoral defeat in memory. But this defeat laid down the base for the Reagan Revolution, because, with the Goldwater's demise, there was a rise of a new star in the Republican Party. Ronald Reagan made his name by this great speech just a few days before the elections. And that was the beginning of Reagan Revolution. And the core of the modern Republican Party, so well represented by Jack Kemp, and that lives today here in this room. Thank you.
We do have a minute or two for questions if anybody wants to ask Garry more. Peggy?
Garry, is it an appropriate question to ask whether democracy in Russia will survive Putin?
The question implies that there is a democracy in Russia today. Yeah, I think that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had few years of not democracy, but a good foundation that could eventually lead for a democratic state. But unfortunately has been destroyed. And it's a long story, it's a sad story, but unfortunately today we cannot say that Putin's demise and collapse of his regime will lead to a democracy. I cannot predict the outcome. Some say the outcome will be worse than Putin. I don't think so, because nothing could be worse than a paranoid, aging dictator with nuclear weapons. There is a huge risk that the collapse of Putin's regime may lead to the collapse of Russia, as it always often happened in history, that the collapse of dictatorship led to the destruction of the country, which was so much centered around one person. But again, we are not in the position to look for ideal resolution of this problem. I think we have to recognize that Putin himself is the greatest threat to the world stability. And anything that brings him down might offer us, a better chance. Yes, Putin's demise means chaos. But, if nothing happens with him, it's a paved road to cemetery.
Are the Russian people fully aware of the amount of his personal corruption and his great personal wealth?
The answer is yes, if you're talking about Russians who are interested in anything that goes beyond their, immediate interest. The problem is that, corruption in Russia is no longer, it has become a system. So for many Russians, corruption means that, you can use your power, your position in this vertical of power for personal benefits. So it's not the same attitude towards corruption for many Russians as it here. So that's why just stories about Putin's corruption may not lead to an immediate, revolt. So if Putin is corrupt, but I live better than I lived yesterday, so be it. So that's unfortunately, the dominant attitude of Russian middle class.
Some people think that Putin's actions were that Putin did what he did in Ukraine because the Russian Republic is collapsing. This is sort of his last gasp to keep it together. The nationalism we talked about, the extensionism. Are you bullish or bearish on the extent to which these are the last days of Putin, or whether we're in this for the long haul?
No, I wouldn't bet my bottom dollar on just, an immediate collapse of Putin's regime tomorrow or next year. But what we know about these kind of regimes, they are unpredictable. When people ask me about my forecast for next 5 years, I'm telling them that I would be happy to make an accurate forecast for the next 5 months or even 5 weeks. Because if you imagine that, say in December last year, somebody could be telling you about the events unfolding in the next 5 months, and would end up with a story saying Russia annexes Crimea, and then Ukrainian troops will be storming the cities in eastern Ukraine, occupied by Russian paramilitary. I mean, you would consider this person insane. So I think we enter the area of uncertainty, and I guess that regime is highly unstable. And the foreign policy aggression is probably only drug that could keep people sort of under these delusions. I don't think it will be immediate, but I think that 2-3 years is a realistic prognosis for the regime to survive. But it also depends on the reaction, because Putin's regimes and Putin's aggression in Ukraine, they are not happening in a vacuum. A lot depends on what America does or it doesn't do, on Europe. It may also depend on US midterm and presidential elections, so the campaign. A lot of things will affect eventually Putin. But I think that in the next few months we'll start seeing this as sort of, it's not the light at the end of a tunnel, but we'll probably recognize the future landscape. We'll have a better vision what is going to happen. But I would probably say that 2 to 3 years, that's the horizon for Putin regime that we can predict today.
What would you say, since Peggy asked to follow us, what would you say are the main internal factors that lead to the instability?
Economy. It's economy. Because Putin's rise to popularity was due to dramatic increase of economic living standards. And this is something that, you know, it was some form of the, again, illusion shared by many Soviet citizens. I'm talking about Soviet citizens, that democracy meant higher living standards. So it was easy in 1990, 1991 to move from totally, you know, just discredited communist regime into something new, because people thought, okay, we move to free and fair elections and democracy will guarantee higher living standards. But it was the opposite for many of them. To move to the 90s brought economic hardship for millions of Russians. And suddenly things changed with Vladimir Putin. So psychologically, for millions and millions of former Soviet citizens, Putin is some form of democracy because he improved their living standards. They don't care about high oil prices, gas, you know, timber, metals. So they could see only, you know, very simple, you know, linear progress. So Yeltsin, disaster, Putin, some form of, you know, prosperity. So that's why it may, you know, it may take time. But if economy really goes down, there will be an immediate backlash. Morton.
So I'm especially interested in your attitude that America is becoming un-American in all these factors. So what are 4 things or 3 things that we need to turn around, and how do you see it possible to turn them?
No, I think it's probably the key word, you know, that has to be, you know, just to be analyzed is the word risk. You know, I did the research, you know, with Google, Instagram. When you look at the millions of book titles, and you look at the words that have been used over 100 years, and you can take any word, and it will be more or less, you know, just linear progress. With the word risk, you suddenly see the jump at the late 60s. It goes up because people have discovered risk. And America lives under this dangerous illusion that you can get rewards without risk. I think it's all about reviving the entire concept of capitalism. Because today people believe that they can save capitalism by employing measures that are so alien to its core values. Yeah, you can take risk. And the more risk you take, you can expect bigger rewards. But if you lose, you lose. So I think it's somehow we should understand that, you know, the society as a whole should be willing to move forward, and even if someone loses, you know, we can still move forward. I think that, you know, we should recover the idea of space exploration. When people say it's too costly and it's just, you know, it's a waste of money, I think exactly the opposite, because everything we do today, all the technologies, they come from the 60s, the Cold War, the space race, and the DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. They came up with internet and GPS and all the concepts in the 60s. And when you look, for instance, at the NASA budget, since 1955 in adjusted dollars, I would argue that was the best investment ever made by U.S. government. It's under $800 billion, and look at the results. So because again, there's so many applications. It's not about flying to moon, building a base there, or flying to Mars, though it's much safer to fly to Mars now than for Columbus to cross the Atlantic. At least we have a map. Yeah. But it's about a side effect. As the moon project was about side effects, about other great things that happen to the economy, when you start with flying to Mars, we suddenly can overcome many things. Because today, let's talk about pharmaceuticals. To pass a new drug, you have to meet so many restrictions. FDA will kill almost every drug. The penicillin or even Tylenol probably would not pass the test today. If you start doing risky things like flying to Mars with chances of return of the crew 50-50, you are not looking for 1 out of 1,000. Anything like 1 out of 3 is already good. So it's all about boosting, the risk attitude, which was very much, part of the culture of this country. People who just, try to open the new territories in the West, they also didn't have a map. But, I think, looking back and restoring the values, and it's not 1, 2, 3. It's a very fundamental. We are willing to take risk, because without risk, there is no progress. And that's what what made America famous, because all these immigrants that came in, they were taking risk because they knew there was nothing left behind them. I think this is an attitude that we have to restore. Thank you.
If anybody wants dessert, there is dessert right outside. So feel free to get some. We have a special treat. We're at Lincoln Cottage, as you all know. Many people don't know much about Lincoln Cottage. And before we go upstairs for our second panel discussion, we have Aaron Carlson-Mast from the Lincoln Cottage to come talk and answer some questions about Lincoln Cottage. But feel free to get dessert, and Aaron, I hope you don't mind.
That's fine. I'm good at talking over people.
Great. And yeah, nice to meet you. Feel free to, if the microphone doesn't really project, so.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll do what I can here. I'm happy to take any questions you all have as well. So I'm the executive director of President Lincoln's Cottage. We are a national monument, a national historic landmark, and a site of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We only opened to the public in 2008 after an 8-year capital project, so we're a fairly new venue for the public. And a lot of people wonder why it took so long for the site to open, as if that somehow diminishes in importance. And that actually, nothing could be further from the truth. It's that we're on the grounds of the Armed Forces Retirement Home here. It has served the same purpose since 1851, before Lincoln ever lived here. It serves that purpose today. You could see the many buildings on the grounds that are used for the over 500 veterans that live here on the grounds of the home today. And it's not their purpose to operate a public museum. So it wasn't until we formed this partnership with the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Armed Forces Retirement Home that we were able to develop this place as a place for the public to come visit. And we are open year-round for public tours and programs, and we're really delighted to have all of you here today for this private event. This type of event, the Kemp Forum on the Future of the American Idea, is really a perfect thing to be holding here. And if I do say so myself, I think President Lincoln's Cottage is probably the perfect place to host this forum. I'm biased, of course. But what makes this place important is the ideas that Lincoln developed while he was living here. Lincoln lived here for over a year of his presidency altogether. They intended to move out here, he and his family, in the summer of 1861, but the outbreak of the Civil War disrupted those plans. In February of '62, their son Willie Lincoln dies, and Mary Lincoln writes to her friends that in their time of sorrow, quiet is very necessary to them. The soldiers' home might have been a little bit quieter than at the White House, but they really weren't getting away from the war by coming out here. In fact, in many ways, they were coming closer to the war. In 1864, when Washington, D.C. is attacked by Confederate General Jubal Early, that attack took place just a mile and a half north of here. The Lincolns were evacuated from the soldiers' home to the White House because that was considered safer. than the soldiers' home, but that didn't keep the Lincolns away. They actually rode out to the fort so that they could watch the skirmish, and a man standing next to President Lincoln actually gets shot in the midst of that as well. And some troops yell at him that he better get down or he'll have his head shot off. So while Lincoln lives here, in the first summer in 1862, when Lincoln lives out here, he begins developing the Emancipation Proclamation in earnest. We know he does this. There are a lot of people that remark on it, both his colleagues in the cabinet and some of the staff members that they had here at the home talk about him developing this proclamation. In fact, his valet said that by the time Lincoln issued the preliminary proclamation in September of 1862, he himself knew the whole thing by heart, from picking up the scraps of paper that Lincoln had been writing his ideas on and storing them for him in the desk that we have upstairs in the Emancipation Room. That's a replica of the desk. And so it's wonderful that you are all actually meeting today and having many of your discussions in the room that we call the Emancipation Room. We call it that because many people have pointed to that room and said that that is the room, historically, they say, that where Lincoln drafted the proclamation. Knowing Lincoln's casual style and his writing style and his drafting style, we know he used this entire house. And in fact, living out here resulted in him being an early Washington commuter. He made the 3-mile ride into the city. We like to joke that it took 45 minutes then, and it takes about 45 minutes today. But it was a little more leisurely in Lincoln's time because he was able to stop and speak to people on the way. And he did this, we know, frequently. So whether it was caravans of wounded soldiers coming back from the front line, and Lincoln wanted to hear from them directly what their impression was of the war on the front, or whether it was the men, women, and children who had formerly been enslaved, who fled into the district to their freedom and were living in contraband camps. These are basically refugee camps throughout the city. And there are numerous stories of Lincoln stopping and talking to them, of them performing, hymns for him. And so he was very, very familiar with their plight. He and his wife, Mary. In fact, the first year the Contraband Relief Association is established, the Lincolns are the single largest private donors to that cause because they were so familiar with what their situation was here in the district. So we know that living here is bringing him into contact with veterans of previous wars. Those are his neighbors, the enlisted men who by the end of their first summer in residence have been assigned as his permanent security detail. He was the first president to have that permanent security detail. So there were over 100 men camped out here who were guarding the president, and also a cavalry who rode with him or tried to ride with him on that commute. We know he outran them a few times, woke up before they did and took off down the road. We also know that that he made trips through the adjacent cemetery, which is the predecessor of Arlington National Cemetery. If you think, a lot of people still don't know that President Lincoln's Cottage exists, try thinking of the number of people who don't realize there's a predecessor to Arlington National Cemetery, where over 8,000 soldiers were buried during the Civil War before Arlington started burials in 1864. We know that Lincoln was deeply affected by what he was seeing, that he felt that what was happening during the Civil War was both necessary but terrible. He believed that this American idea is something that had to be preserved, and he talks about that frequently in meetings with people right here in these very rooms where you're meeting today. We are the only national monument in the entire country that is a private nonprofit. We receive no federal government operating support. We decided to do something pretty radical and furnish the house with Lincoln's ideas rather than furnishing. So while we have some period furniture, we do emphasize his ideas and have period quotes and images that we bring into the spaces to help tell the story of what Lincoln did here. So if I could see a show of hands, how many of you knew about President Lincoln's Cottage before you were invited to the forum? Excellent. And how many of those of you who knew about it had actually been here before? All right, fewer still. So I hope that what you experience here today really moves you to help us spread the word about this amazing place. Whether that means writing an article, I know we have a lot of journalists in the room, telling a bunch of your friends, bringing people out for visits. We think that we have something really special here, and we want to share it with as many people as we can, and we're thrilled to be able to share it here with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. This is your chance. If you have a question, ask Aaron.
Yes, ma'am.
You can see Lincoln's ideas and his thinking and the historical context in any number of books. You cannot see the chair he sat in any number of books. Tell me about the decision. Was it partly or largely a financial decision not to chase down Lincoln memorabilia and the chair that was in the room
It wasn't a financial decision. In fact, it actually would have been cheaper for us to fill the room with period furniture. And that likely would have been our only option because, as I mentioned, we opened in 2008. So at this point, most of Lincoln's belongings are scattered already in other institutions. In fact, the original desk was transferred from the Soldiers' Home to the White House in 1930 is when Lou Hoover said, "I want that for my husband's office." We didn't ask the White House for the desk back, but the White House isn't giving the desk back. So we were allowed to make a replica of that. We didn't want to overshadow the authenticity of this place with furniture. And we found as we do...
Furniture that was not real.
Right. Because most of the originals has either been scattered or they're already in other museums. We know, for example, that the Lincolns were bringing 19 cartloads of furnishings and personal effects with them from the White House. So they were likely bringing stuff from the White House, but through all of our 8 years of research and any inventory we've been able to, look through, the information wasn't there. And that research is ongoing just out of, intellectual curiosity's sake. But we also know there have been numerous inflection points over the last 30 years that while furnished house museums do an excellent job in education in some ways, they tend to overshadow the events and what took place there. And we found during the Capitol Project that the more furniture we had in the room, whether it was something original or not, the more people wanted to talk about that piece of furniture rather than the person who was here and the ideas that were developed here. So it was partly a strategic concept that we wanted to focus on what was authentic and the ideas that were important here rather than furnishings. But it was also, an easy decision in some ways because many of the original furnishings that they would have had here just no longer exist.
Great. Aaron, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all. We've got about a 10-minute break, and we will reconvene for growth. 10 minutes upstairs.